Today, we will look at Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road, which was first published in 2006, and we will also look at a concept, the post-apocalypse. Cormac McCarthy's novel has frequently been associated with this concept and has been described as one of the sort of foundational texts of post-apocalyptic fiction. So let's unpack this concept first. What do we mean when we say that a film or a novel is post-apocalyptic? Superficially speaking, it seems clear what this concept describes. We can all imagine what a post-apocalyptic novel or a post-apocalyptic landscape or even a post-apocalyptic computer game, say, are like. It's something that has very much permeated popular culture, and it's a term that has been used also as an editorial genre. So at this level, post-apocalypse describes the aftermath of a major catastrophe. An apocalypse in this context is simply a disaster of unprecedented magnitude. It could be a man-made disaster, it could be a natural disaster. So the survivors of an extreme weather event, for example, say the people who lived in New Orleans after the disaster caused by Hurricane Katrina, they could be said to have inhabited a post-apocalyptic landscape. Now, that is, of course, not what the term apocalypse originally described, and if we go back to this original meaning, and if we go back to the etymology of the term apocalypse, we realize that things are more complicated than they appear at first sight, because an apocalypse in the religious sense, in the traditional sense, is the revelation. It's when things are revealed in their definitive meaning because time has come to an end. So the concept of apocalypse originates in the broader framework of Christian or generally monotheistic linear time. It's a concept which is teleological, and it speaks to us with this kind of sort of sense of eschatological urgency. It's literally the last thing that happens. It's not simply a major catastrophe or event. So at that level, Cormac McCarthy's novel, or any novel that is described as post-apocalyptic, appears to be a paradox. How can anything be post-apocalyptic if the apocalypse is the end of the world? How can anything happen after the end of the world? So if we engage with the term apocalypse and its religious and cultural roots at this level, then the term post-apocalypse contains a challenge, an intellectual challenge, because it urges us to rethink our whole idea of space and time and closure. So let's look at some of these questions in more detail now. Let me begin with a definition of the current understanding of the term apocalypse, which is provided by the American scholar Warren Wager in this book, Terminal Visions, The Literature of Last Things, which was one of the pioneering studies of apocalypse fiction. So Warren Wager says that in the course of the 20th century, the term apocalypse comes to be used much more frequently to describe what he calls disaster in the highest order of magnitude, the idea of the end of the world not as a restatement or exegesis of biblical eschatology, but as a creative act of the secular imagination. What does this mean for our specific understanding of post-apocalypse? What happens to the term apocalypse when this religious imagination is no longer specifically used or evoked to describe a moment of divine judgment, but to describe any, as he says, disaster in the highest order of magnitude? So I'm going to now look at two definitions of post-apocalypse. The first one is provided by Teresa Heffernan in this book, which is in the first books to actually use the term post-apocalyptic, The full title, as you can see here, is Post-Apocalyptic Culture, Modernism, Postmodernism, and the 20th Century Novel. And Heffernan writes, the present world is portrayed as exhausted, by which she means to say portrayed in contemporary fiction. But, she continues, there is no better world that replaces it. These narratives refuse to offer up a new beginning or any hope of rebirth or renewal. The end is instead senseless and arbitrary. There is no overarching critique, there is no cataclysmic destruction, and there is no resolution or salvation. What underlies Heffernan's argument here is the idea that we live in a world which is already experiencing catastrophe. It's already experiencing cataclysmic destruction, not as a momentous event, but as an ongoing process of decline. And much more recently, exactly this idea has been expressed by the climate scientist and eco-critic Timothy Morton, who writes in this important book called Hyperobjects in 2013. The spooky thing is, we discover global warming precisely when it's already here. It is like realizing that for some time you have been conducting your business in the expanding sphere of a slow-motion nuclear bomb. You have a few seconds for amazement as the fantasy that you inhabited a neat, seamless little world melts away. All those apocalyptic narratives of doom about the end of the world are, from this point of view, part of the problem, not part of the solution. The hyperobject spells doom now, not at some future date. I won't have time now to really explain this idea of the hyperobject, but even without focusing on this, you can see from the section that I've given you that Timothy Morton, like Teresa Heffernan, insists that we are experiencing apocalyptic destruction now in the present, and our idea of a global catastrophe is not something that waits for us in a remote future. But what happens to the biblical imagination in this context? Is it still appropriate then to even use the term apocalypse? The cultural critic Richard de la Mora edited a book called Postmodern Apocalypse. And in his introduction to this, he says, and I quote, "The uncircumscribed field of narrative at the fin de millennium," so the final years of the 20th century, continues to be structured, if only negatively, in relation to apocalypse. This unsettling realization requires cultural critics to subject to ever-renewed analysis the framing of popular and political beliefs in apocalyptic narratives. What does this mean? What de la Mora says here is that even though we are now experiencing catastrophe as something that unfolds around us, that began in the past and reaches out into our future, despite the fact that we are no longer in a position to imagine catastrophe as a divine judgment or even a sort of natural event in the future. Despite all this, we still only have the language that comes to us through our cultural tradition. So we still have to work with the popular and political beliefs that come to us from this age-old tradition of religious apocalyptic belief. And critics have to sort of reframe and renew their analysis all the time. But what exactly characterizes the cultural tradition of apocalyptic belief? What are these legacies that, according to de la Mora, permeate our current understanding of catastrophe? Here's a first suggestion, which comes from the theologian and religious researcher John Wallis. John Wallis says, the apocalyptic imagination has a tendency to conceive the world in starkly dualistic terms. There are, in other words, no shades of grey within apocalypticism, nor any moral ambiguity. So this is the first important point. If we think about the apocalypse and if we think about catastrophe in terms of the cultural tradition of religious apocalypse, then we are likely to imagine end time in terms of a kind of sort of battle between good and evil. This, of course, is very much true for Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where we have, on the one hand, the absolutely positive figure of the son, where we have the heroic, self-sacrificing, albeit problematic figure of the father, and then on the other hand, we have these completely abhorrent and utterly evil characters, the cannibals, right? Who really are, and the cannibal in has a long cultural history of sort of standing for absolute evil, right? Going back all the way to the, if you wish, to the 16th and even 15th century, to the first reports from the New World, from the Americas. Cormac McCarthy's novel has this attention to good and evil, but there are also other traditions of apocalypticism which it endorses. For example, Marina Warner says in this book that the book of Revelation has what she calls a redundant nastiness. It has a kind of sort of lingering, unexamined moral force that centuries of thought about justice and humanity have not managed to put aside. Again, this seems to me to be very relevant to Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy's novel is a very humorless book, and it's a very bleak book. There is a kind of sort of almost, you might say, a sadistic pleasure in sort of seeing how far he can go, the narrator can go in kind of sort of shocking the reader out of what might be imagined as their complacency, and really sort of pushing them beyond the comfort of their acquired and simply taken for granted beliefs about justice and humanity, and how much it sort of this nastiness, this black and white world is presented to us as something which really is sort of supposedly there revealed to us as the true nature of humanity. Finally, of course, Cormac McCarthy's novel was written during a time which still is broadly perhaps defined as the sort of final years of a cultural movement called postmodernism, or perhaps we might say that Cormac McCarthy and other writers of the early 21st century marked precisely the end of this postmodern sensibility. So let's look at this term as well. Postmodernism, and you have some of the main theorists of postmodernism listed here: Fredric Jameson, Brian McKay, Linda Hutcheon, Jean-François Lyotard, and Hans Bertens. Postmodernism is very often associated with fractured narratives, with irony, with virtuosity, with self-consciousness. And Richard Rorty, a philosopher who famously wrote a book called Contingency, Irony and Solidarity, he brings this sort of idea of postmodern irony to religion. And he says, in fact, our aim should be to, as writers, as thinkers, to transcend the what he calls the earnestness of the lack of self-irony in traditional religious discourse. And he says we need to sort of move towards what he calls a post-metaphysical culture and a post-religious one. And this is sort of specifically how he puts this. You see the quotation here. That is why the novel, the movie, the TV program have gradually but steadily replaced the sermon and the treatise as the principal vehicles of social change and progress. Now, this doesn't really sort of seem to quite fit with Cormac McCarthy's novel. Cormac McCarthy's The Road is not, in this kind of sort of sense, playful, ironic. Rather, it seems to reflect or express what Amy Hungerford has called a new religious sublime. And this definition, this third definition of postmodern religion, I think is the one which really fits Cormac McCarthy. Hungerford writes, and I quote, "Sincerity overshadows irony as a literary mode when the ambiguities of language are imagined as being religiously empowered. Writers in this mode see fracture and materialism not as ends in themselves, but as the conditions of transcendence." So, let's look a bit more closely at a few passages from The Road, and I will also show you some images from John Hillcoat's filmic adaptation from 2009. Hillcoat was very keen to really work closely with Cormac McCarthy and to translate the novel as accurately, as imaginatively, but also as attentively as possible into another medium. So John Hillcoat thought of his film as an adaptation rather than as a rewriting or a creative response to the film. He follows the novel as much as possible, scene by scene, and tries to sort of find ways of rendering Cormac McCarthy's minimalistic style in filmic terms. So he gives, where Cormac McCarthy, for example, uses very short sentences and very little description, John Hillcoat gives us these large, empty horizons, very few actors in the frame, and very few recognizable landmarks, and so on and so forth. And you see from the titles of the two covers here, of course, that this idea of a rewriting, of an accurate translation, of a rendering in a different medium is very much also foregrounded by the covers. So when the film was published, and even when the book was published as well, critics believed that there was in this book a very considerable, remarkable use of the language of Christianity, and this is most clearly evident in the names of the characters. They're called the Father and the Son, so there is a kind of sort of Christological narrative, if you wish, but also from some of the recurrent allegories and tropes that we find in the text, such as the light. The Son repeatedly asks the Father, "We are the ones who carry the light, aren't we?" And this critics struggled with this and struggled to sort of make sense of whether Cormac McCarthy was celebrating a particular Christian idea of end time, or whether he was trying to subvert it, or whether he was even ridiculing it. And you can see here from the comments that I've taken from various different reviews, more or less from a random sample. You can see that the reviewers position themselves somewhat uncomfortably in relation to this fact that McCarthy engages with religion. So somebody says that The Road draws inspiration from the New Testament and looks at the bleaker sides of Revelation. Somebody else says that it is a document of the so-called tribulation of Judeo-Christian mythology. Somebody else says more sort of affirmatively that it invokes the promise of Christian redemption. But then the final one on this list, it says it recalls as in another perverse imitation the eternity of Augustine's otherworldly God. So we have the whole range from Cormac McCarthy's text being a promise of redemption to allegedly it being a perverse imitation. So why is it possible to read this text in so many different ways? Why is it possible to be in such sort of apparent disagreement over its meaning? This is something to do, as we said, with the peculiar transformation of the religious language of end time at the beginning of the 21st century, when this language is used, is still used, but is now used to express this kind of sort of sense of a lingering, of an ongoing catastrophe. But it also has something to do with the very specific style of Cormac McCarthy's novel, and the novel is, for those of you who read it, you will realize and you will understand what I mean. It's written in a surprisingly minimalist style, and it's written with a kind of sort of semantic openness and attention to rhythm and pace and meter that we would more commonly associate with lyrical poetry and not with the novel. But also, and this is the final point I would like to make, it is a text which actually very much foregrounds this idea of apocalypse not as event but as being. This is the idea which I tried to explain earlier in relation to Teresa Heffernan and post-apocalypse, and also in relation to Timothy Morton. So the idea that we are inhabitants of a post-apocalyptic world where everything terrible has already happened. This very much appears to be the case in the fictional universe of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. For a start, and this is a very important point, we never really find out why the world is in such a bad shape in Cormac McCarthy's novel. What has caused this destruction? There's only one very brief reference to a moment of a flash of bright light, and to the and in that same scene the clock stop and the father runs and fills the bathtub with water, because he's clearly somebody who is, we would say, perhaps a prepper or a survivalist. But other than this one reference to an apocalyptic event of sorts, really what we have is the description of a world which is destroyed, which is barren, which is almost devoid of life, and we have no further specific explanation of this. So the attention is not on apocalypse as an event at all, but on this kind of sort of state of devastation, post-apocalypse again. And this is even evident in the very first sentence of the novel, which I'm going to read to you. When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he'd reach out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness, and the days more grey each one than what had gone before, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. Some of the chief ingredients of Cormac McCarthy's style are evident here. So you have, as I said, this attention to rhythm, to meter, this very controlled and conscious use of alliteration when he woke in the woods, and also of repetition. Nights dark beyond darkness, and days more grey each one than what has gone before. and then short sentences, very little by way of a description, and then quite strikingly this term glaucoma, which explodes into this short paragraph like a kind of sort of foreign element, triggering almost a chain reaction. We stumble upon this word and we try and sort of remember what it means, and it doesn't quite fit. And it seems to be a very odd term to use to describe the world. But of course, it's precisely this sensibility which Cormac McCarthy tries to convey, this idea of sort of things dimming away, things disappearing. If you look at this final quotation, and I think we will stop here, the reference to names is also very striking. The names of things slowly following those things into oblivion, colors, the names of birds, things to eat. Finally, the names of things once believed to be true, more fragile than he would have thought. How much was gone already? The sacred idiom shorn of its reference, and so of its reality, drawing down like something trying to preserve heat in time to wink out forever. So we have very powerfully here, as I said, this sense of a kind of sort of dimming, of a fading away, of something which is slowly, as he says here, disappearing into oblivion. This is precisely the spirit, the cultural mode of post-apocalypse. So I would invite you to read this novel very carefully and to think about the various things that I've said. How does it use the religious tradition of Christianity? How does it use the religious language of Christianity? Does it mark a subversion of the beliefs? Is the language used ironically? But there seems to be very little irony or humor in this novel. So how does Cormac McCarthy in this post-apocalyptic novel really position himself in relation to this long tradition, and how does he position himself in relation to our present?